if you see it as a partition film, it's actually really unpredictable in many ways. And it doesn't fit in your typical notion of what one can expect to see in a film on partition. And I wanted both of you to sort of respond to how is it that you envisioned it and how did it change in the course of the edit, especially, and how did you first sort of start thinking about this film, and how did it change to evolve into something like this, which has a very fragmented quality to it, which actually in a way mirrors partition itself. I love that shot of the Google map. What was that? The Google, what is it? Google Earth. Yeah, the thing in which everything sort of gets split. The man's half the body is here and half the body is. And the film also has a kind of quality of, things just start building up and then you just sort of withdraw. You just give us a jolt and then we go on to something else. So if you can just talk us through the process a little bit, that would be great.
Thanks for everyone for coming here. And thanks to Urban Lens also for having this film as the opening film. I think its screening in Delhi is always interesting. Okay, so I started thinking about it, I think, much before that I actually started working on it, in the sense of just the kind of silence around partition, or what it really means to have experienced it, and how it remains in the memory of people who experienced it. So that was much before. And then this kind of looking at my grandmother and her group of friends, it just struck me that, oh, of course, they're all, partition refugees. And then if one looks around West Delhi, which is now, of course, it's changing quite a bit, the demographic, but primarily have been like partition refugees. But it's not something which is like really at the surface in terms of conversations, or even like identity, like where you're coming from, where's your native village kind of thing. It's not in Punjab, but you're Punjabi. So what does that mean? And so that was one thing. And the other thing, when I actually started shooting, or started thinking about, okay, how to frame this kind of conversation around partition, and I do see it as a conversation, because also not being able to fully understand what it might have felt like, or what it means to go through something that is at this scale. It was also important to really listen to also what they are saying, and then kind of take it from there in your own understanding as well. And then the big thing was actually to try and not focus around the violence, because that is something that has retained and sort of just stuck with the idea of partition, and reinvented itself in so many ways, even in like contemporary politics or other things that we've seen. So the point was not to look at just that, but also to look at what were the other things. There are so many things, like we were just talking about, which are not part of the film, in terms of language and just things around the house, dariya, utensils, the whole way of life that kind of was either reinvented, basically a huge shift happened at the time. So looking at that also, and also then also the idea of property and the department of the custodian, which kind of filtered in later. So there were all of these things that were kind of exploding in these conversations or interviews that I was having, that it was going in several directions. So that, I think, for me, in its shooting became important to retain as the aesthetic, instead of like trying to direct it in a kind of like coherent, or not coherent, but let's say a linear narrative in some way. And then I think with that, I just went with Anupama and said, okay, now this is what I'm thinking, and you sort of see, what do you feel? So maybe she can talk about the editing process.
So as an editor, for me, a film is never about anything. So even if Priyanka might have told me it's about partition, it was very far from my mind as I looked at the rushes. Because when I look at rushes, I just look at them. I don't think about too much. And both Priyanka is also an editor. So I think in the edit room, to a certain extent, we had a similar attitude to the rushes, in the sense that we were looking at them. And things that we hadn't seen before certainly came out in that process. For example, Buaji, the really old lady who's 90 plus, I just loved her right away. I mean, for me, I'm like, this woman is amazing, even before she'd opened her mouth. In the shot, the way she takes about 20 minutes to cross the frame from left to right, I just really liked that. And so things that perhaps are not obvious when you think about a film on partition sort of began to foreground themselves when we looked at the rushes with no real preconceptions, because as Priyanka just said, things changed as she shot. So the things that began foregrounding is that anyone who is old enough to remember partition is also quite old. So, so somewhere we started thinking about, age and, what it does to you as a person, and how if you've survived such a traumatic event, which it was, then the rest of life is a huge process of survival and rebuilding. But we didn't think about it so consciously. These things sort of came out. Now, as for the violence of partition, there were certainly things in the rushes, and we could have made that kind of film. And we had that option, right? But somehow it didn't interest us because women are very much the center of this story. The story of partition women has generally been very much centered on abducted women, and rightly so. But there are so many other female narratives that have really not been voiced, and in fact, I'm not sure how much of that happens in this film also. But somehow, as a female person with my own very, female kind of cultural history, I could really relate to things like something that didn't make it into the rushes, somebody whose scissors were returned to them, after the partition, in all that mad rush of everyone running with whatever they could carry in their hands. Somebody who was running picked up somebody's scissors and came several months after this event to return it to them. And I was just charmed by this story. And I felt, yes, this is it. Because I've lived through a war myself, and all these great historical traumatic events happen actually in very ordinary, unimpressive ways in the end. So for me, it wasn't important, but I guess that's the point of view. So.
Yeah, it was actually so beautiful how the everyday and mundane constantly seeps in and always competes with these large traumatic things that people are saying, and in the middle it's like ye patta kahan hai, and so it was. And somehow as a director you didn't sort of say, okay, this is sort of distracting, so why don't we do a sit down interview so that we can just focus on the intensity of that moment. So this kind of the past and present constantly sort of intervening with each other. So I really enjoyed that. So is that when you were shooting, did you sort of think that maybe it would be better to not have so much of chaos and have individual interviews with people and so on? Is that something you explored?
I did try it, but I didn't feel that it was doing justice to the conversation I wanted to bring out, in the sense that when I was thinking again, like of partition or of the nature of memory or how they might remember it, they were, in any case, I mean, it's like, you think of something and then you go in 5 different directions, and then, but you're also at that point doing something. So I wanted to sort of formally kind of put that out as the, space which, let's say, is inhabited at the same time, which is something in any case that interests me, this kind of simultaneity of, time and space and all that. And also because somewhere I wanted to draw a connection between home and household and properties, these or property in the sense of, the way Mr. Charandas is talking about, like land that you own legally, which also actually now as I'm reading more about it is actually what made them citizens of this country, because there was no, I think at that time, other identification before permits and passports and all. So that was also the making of a citizen at that time. Otherwise you were just refugees from here to there, and you were actually from Pakistan. So anyway, and so I wanted to explore this idea of the home, and fir home mein kya hota hai? This is like daily life with events of great importance in the sense of what is going to be cooked and how are things going to be managed and the logistics of it. So just trying to kind of give it the same kind of space, which I think luckily comes across in that conversation between Mr. Charandas and Mrs. Sunita, where she's like insisting that this is what happened in Delhi, and he is also doing the same, but he feels the need to say that he's making a political point, whereas she is also doing that. So I think it becomes a summary of what I was trying to do, which is why all these other events are also part of like they had to be, it couldn't be without it. Like the life of home.
And also, in a sense, you're not essentializing your the characters in your film as refugees or people who are victims or or partition refugees or something. They are people who've experienced this and they have a lot of other things going on. And this constant sense, and I remember even seeing it at the rough cut stage, that for me it's so much about that sense of rebuilding and agency, and that okay, now you built another home, you're here, in a quite a comfortable place in a sense, economically. So that really comes through, that you're not just putting them in a box. I also wanted to sort of ask you, because you're filming with your grandmother in your home, so in a sense you had complete access. But the film, the way you have filmed, it has a lot of restraint in it. I mean, I'm sure you had access to many more things. You could have asked many more things. But there's always sort of a line maybe you've drawn for yourself as a filmmaker, especially towards the end when it's just sort of left at a tantalizing point when she's so on. So, but we don't exactly know what is that, and you didn't get into it. So, I just wanted to sort of find out what were your thoughts as you were making, because as a filmmaker, sometimes you say, okay, isme maza nahi aa raha hai, let's push more, let's get something more interesting. So, how did you get that balance, as considering you had all the access?
I think one is also that, I mean, again, I'll refer to the edit we had previously, because that was very, very different, and it was perhaps maybe more closer to, because there were a lot more freewheeling conversations and many more different scenarios, and all other events also. Like, for example, 1984 is just about mentioned here, whereas there was a lot more going on. So that I think Anupama can speak about. But for myself, I think in terms of the way I like to approach something is to kind of not get into like not detail, but like kind of not even maybe psychological detail in terms of like, this is what happened to me and this is exactly how it played out. But since there was maybe also a conceptual framework that I was trying to explore, I wanted to leave things at a point where it could resonate in different combinations in like an audience's mind, that they might they might relate to the thought, but how it plays out in their life could be different. So that I like to keep it open. Maybe that maybe some people feel that it's kind of not enough mal, but that's the that's the choice of aesthetic. But you want to?
No, I mean, I didn't feel that, because for me, this film is, I love the characters. I love how they look, because the way they look is also who they are. And I don't know if you have to be from Delhi to read that, or you can just get it no matter where you are. But sometimes I wonder if this is more a Delhi film in that sense. I mean, the card playing aunties, I mean, I'm just like, oh my God, I mean, my grandmother did the same thing, except that, she dressed very differently. So just the clothes, everything, tell their own stories. So for me, the silences are not really silences. The furniture, the clothes, the accent, a certain way of speaking Punjabi, certain expressions are all telling their own stories. And everyone talks in exactly the same way, which in subtitles, I'm not sure. So for me, half the story is there. So it's not so much in facts and detailing, it's in these shared cultural histories that you carry forward in your personas. Other than that, Priyanka working with a conceptual framework and trying to keep things within that, none of her characters really cooperated with her, especially her Dadi. I mean, all the stuff that I've edited out is, like Priyanka pushing her Dadi and Dadi not allowing herself to be pushed. And lots of things like that. And so you, as a director, I'm sure you set off with several ideas, but none of these women really cooperated with them. That was the fun of it. I think they did exactly how they pleased, and which comes across in the card game, where one Mrs. Lamba is trying very hard to tell the story of partition, and Mrs. Oh, sorry. She's just saying, "Arey, chhod do, rehne bhi do," because cards are much more important. So I enjoyed that.
Well, I have more to ask, but maybe we can open it out to some questions at this point, if there are any. Any comments? Yeah.
That greeting gift shop called Kiss and Love. I thought that was a Ramesh Nagar representative.
Okay, I haven't even noticed
And
it.
I laughed the loudest at that scene. I thought she's like, this is so bang on, I can't tell you. And the part where she says, kitty party mein nahi ja sakti kyunki doctor ne mana kiya. I thought that was so Delhi, so West Delhi, but also Delhi so much. That's just the point I wanted to add. I think, I do agree with that. Maybe that in a way confines the partition narrative to one center, but that has merit in itself also. So.
Thanks. No, I mean, it's true that though every time I watch it now, I do reflect on how, in a way, it's restricted also by like the people it's looking at and all of that. And considering Delhi, there is actually so much more. And now when as I'm reading more and I listen to Buaji saying ki oh, masjidon mein rehte the, it sparks off a whole other set of relations in my head. So, but I suppose at least it's like a starting point.
Do you think you lucked out with the characters a little? Because I feel those, even if it is a documentary, the characters were so unique. And so perhaps then, did characters bring you that story, or did you have a story in mind and you just asked questions and things started coming? Like, who brought this to you? How do I say it? They're just so interesting characters. I feel like I want to ask every single thing about history with them. So did the characters dictate this film in that sense?
Well, I think it dictated the way it took shape, in the sense of, the certain reluctance to talk about some things, the kind of, like she was mentioning, one person wanting to, the other one just being like, can we forget about this and move on? So it kind of, or Buaji, for example, talking about marriage in a certain way, and then also about other things. So, I mean, to me, because they're so familiar and I'm, grown up around them, I think the uniqueness could be in the way they are just themselves, because one is maybe used to having these definitions represented a certain way in cinema. So that, like you were saying, it doesn't essentialize those characters and kind of just allows them to be who they are. And in that way, I don't think people could be boring in that way. I think, like, if you kind of looked at it, let them be, and then just kind of.
And also, I think if you have to allow that to come into the film and not think that that's not relevant. I think that's the beauty of the film, that when you see the footage, then what do you see is relevant. If you're only going to see, okay, somebody's crying or somebody's narrating a traumatic event, and so that's like good material for a film. But if you say somebody's saying something totally mundane and seemingly pointless, and then you choose to include that. And I think this film has so many of those moments. That's what makes them real, makes the characters seem real. So even though the characters are who they are, I think it's the way that they come across is totally something that's been done in the edit and in the film by the filmmakers.
Only a comment. I liked very much your film for two different things. The way you introduce the idea of art in documentary. So the way you mix art and anthropology in a sense, and in a very sensorial way. This is a very observational, sensorial film. It is not necessarily something that about storytelling, but it's more about the sensations that creates in the audience, and the way the audience can perceive with very different, you have materiality there, so all objects of women. You have the idea of what an old woman is, with all their stories about the marriage. So you have different kind of stories which are telling the story of the partition. So this is very beautiful. I think it's really amazing. So yeah, the way you as a female director make a portrait on other females. So the female perspective, I think it's very beautiful in this film, and it is something that you feel in the sensoriality. So the idea that you are a female, it's important because the film is sensorial and observational, and you have a lot of tenderness when you when you convey certain things. No, it's very perceptive. It's not it's not something about mind. So, and it's very interesting the way it's very artistic, this film, and I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, well, just to respond to that a little, I think the observational part is really all Priyanka as an editor. It took me some time to see what she was seeing. You know, it was not so immediate. For example, the scene where Dadi is playing cards but talking on the phone constantly, the circular card game where she stays on the phone call. But I was like, what is this? What is this? What is this? And Priyanka kept saying, it's so funny. Can you see what she's doing? It is very funny, but it took me about 2 weeks to get the joke. I was like, nobody's going to get the joke, you know. So, I think Priyanka, and obviously having grown up with everyone around her, knows them very well. And that helped. I think there are two approaches in filmmaking. Very often you don't know people, and sometimes you do. So, that I think even I sort of slowly grew to see. Yeah.
She gave space.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's not a film about the filmmaker.
Yeah. No,
It's
definitely.
a film about
not.
the character.
It is.
It
It
is.
is.
So this is very beautiful.
Yeah.
Like she gave them space, she didn't push. Like, I need to know what exactly happened there.
Yeah.
What exactly? How the Muslims came and what they did there.
Yeah.
It was not the idea, it was
No.
giving space
Yeah.
to a reflection. It's kind of meditative also.
Yes.
Mixing very well of Western tools with very fluid Oriental vision.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
My question is actually, it was during that scene where Priyanka was pushing her Daviji to sort of tell more, and just for that splash of a second, Daviji's glasses were down and she was sort of just knitting there, and there was just that silence. So I was wanting to know that while Dadiji was dodging the question कि मुझे नहीं याद है, do you think Dadiji went into some sort of a flashback while you were directing?
That we wouldn't know. Only she can tell. I wouldn't know. She was also not asking you
If you felt that the silence was deliberate, I think that was she holding something back, perhaps? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
That she didn't want to say, that she was holding something back?
I mean, my constant questioning indicates that perhaps there is something more there. Now, whether she was holding something back, I wouldn't know. I mean, she was also not well, so later I would imagine that was it too much pushing in the sense of like her to be pushed to then think back something which she actually can't remember or she doesn't want to remember, one won't know. But the fact that the silence is there means, I mean, we've kept it, is to indicate that it could be this and that. But we don't know.
There's a question back there.
How were you able to manage these sets of senior relatives of the family? What was your brief to them when you started making the film, really? As to how did you get them not to prop up and get ready for the cameras and so on and so forth? What was going on in their mind as you started preparing them for this?
So initially, actually, that also led me to frame it around the card game, because in trying to get them to individually sit down and talk about it was going to be a bit difficult, and I have to give my mother full credit for convincing them to be like slightly invested in this. And because I also think that these are not conversations you just casually kind of start off, and perhaps I can't be sure. Maybe no one's ever actually asked them. So while some of them were quite enthusiastic like Buaji, for example, in sitting down and having this conversation and fully kind of opening up about the details, and the setup was pretty straightforward, that this is what I'm thinking about and I don't know much and we've never spoken about it, so then can you tell me? And she was quite open. And otherwise the group setting helped because the dynamic kind of framed the way information was given out. So I think Mrs. Divan's wanting to stop Mrs. Lamba actually got her to talk about it, which is what I was hoping would happen. And that's how, yeah, because if I would have asked her that same question, she was telling me stuff, but the fact that she was saying ki ab bas rehne do kept wanting her to, she wanted to say ki nahi nahi, but this is, let me just finish this thought and then we'll carry on the game. So in that sense, even after we showed the film while it was finished, some new information was coming out from all of them. And then I was like, okay, now this is, well, the boat has sailed, but okay. So, but that has, I think, happened in every screening, whether it's with the characters in the film or even just at home or other people, just more conversations and information about the partition and experiences have always come up in every single screening, after every single screening. So I think it's like just a mix of something that is a part of your life, which you haven't forgotten, but you haven't spoken about it too much as well. So yeah, we see a glimpse of that, how it could have gone if that happened. But then, and we would have gotten the history we know in like already so many ways. So then that was obviously the point, to not do that again, to open up the experience of partition from these different points of view, which can hopefully help us to think about that and now differently. I think it took us like a year to edit it, and then
It's 8 months to edit it.
a year to make it. But in my head, it's been going on for 2 years or two and a half.
You've been shooting it for a while.
Yeah, off and on.
Yeah.
So maybe 2 years, one can say.
Are there other questions? Yeah, couple of them.
Yeah. And it's a wonderful movie and documentary, though I missed a major part of it. I've got in my family who have experienced this partition in the eastern part. My question was actually more or less same with the gentleman. It's very difficult for you maybe to answer how many hours, at a length you required with the senior citizen. You, for in your case, it's very difficult, I feel.
Yeah, no, that was difficult. Of course, they couldn't,
How many hours of shooting roughly? Not in continuous form, just an idea.
You're saying
How many hours of shooting?
at a stretch, how long did I sit with
Yeah.
each one of them?
Yeah.
Maybe like 2 hours tops, not more than that. Not 2 hours of talking, 2 hours of just spending time with them.
My name is Kapil, and as I'm seeing this movie, this partition movie, is my Nana and Nani has also came from Pakistan, and means they have left all their family members, and they were young, around 10 or 12 years when they left the country of Pakistan, and means the movie is very great. One thing I want to ask you, there is a scene where there's a man has his property papers, means has his own property papers of Pakistan. So, while interviewing with them, do you find that they are still hoping, means in their conscious, subconscious mind, they are still hoping that India and Pakistan will merge again? Is there still hope in their conscious mind? Because as I'm seeing their conversation, they are missing their home as they are refugees. So I find out that maybe they are hoping that they will get back to their home again in Pakistan. So that's the question I want to ask. Means, did you find at the time of interviewing with them that they are still missing their home, or there is still hope? That's the question
I mean,
want to ask.
you really think anybody, even in the space of memory, is kind of no, in the sense like Pakistan after its making meant completely something else than what their home meant to them. So I think that difference is really important, because the place that they are talking about, whoever it might be, whether it's east or west, the space, or just social life or culture or anything, pre-partition is not there anymore in the same way. It's only, I think it's only there in their memory. It's not the same place anymore. Its politics is not the same, way. I mean, just look at where we are and what are we talking about in contemporary discourse. So I don't think, if there was even like a minuscule aspiration of anybody dreaming that India and Pakistan, it has not showed up anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question, I suppose, that everyone who has a history like this must ask at some point, right? Do you still miss your old home? And I suppose nostalgia is very powerful, and anyone who's had to leave a home country and settle somewhere else will always have some amount of nostalgia, which is the end of the film. Remember Dadi recalling her wonderful life in Pakistan, right? But all the way up till then, we've not had any nostalgia as such. I think these are very intimate. I think that kind of pain comes through in a few small moments in the film. If you want to know, did you find it in the process of shooting? So when Buaji, for example, is saying that she cannot sleep at night, she lies awake and she looks at the clock and she thinks of the people who have gone, right? And she can't stop it, and Dadi advises her to not do it and not think of the past. This is true both of partition and also of extreme old age. So I don't think you can say very clearly, because when you are that age, most of your family and most of your friends are dead, right? And all you're left with is looking back. So I don't know whether you can say, is it looking back to a country that once was, or is it looking back to a life that once was? I'm not sure what I've left in the edit, but certainly in the process of watching the rushes, there was a lot of clarity in the minds of the characters, a very clear-cut idea of things that had happened. There was no sugarcoating of it in nostalgia. It was a horrible, violent, traumatic ripping up. And they didn't dress it in a longing for a fabled past, because that just went by the way in the very hard realities of the life that followed. So I think a lot of them had to shed those ideas very quickly. And I think this is my personal opinion. I'm sure people would disagree with me. But this narrative of the beautiful united country that once was, I feel, is something that has been created to also cover up a lot of the realities that once were. Right? It's very easy to say that we were all the same once and we all lived together very happily in this pre-Lapsarian, pre-1947 country until this happened. But I don't think that's true. So that's my personal take. And I think to some extent the film has some of that in the pragmatism of these characters. So.
Are there any other comments or questions?
Section. And that is, I think, it's completely director's things. How she really feel it and convey it. That's wonderful. That's really good.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for the beautiful film.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So should we
Yeah,
close
if
with
we
that
can wind up
comment?
now. Yeah.
Yeah. So if there are
Thanks.
other comments, I'm sure they'll be available outside. Thank you, Anupama. Thank you, Priyanka.